Chamber music is an alchemy between movement and balance. Not the synchronization of each beat, which would chop the discourse, but rather a projection of a phrase's direction, arrival point, and how the different textures the composer reserves to each of the instruments combining in the whole reach that point, not necessarily together every beat. It doesn't mean that we have to be careless about the subdivision of the beats in order to be together. But what matters is in which direction we look together and where each phrase of the narration leads to the next, and how that becomes then to do with the fact that the piano, for instance, in chamber music, unless you play several pianos, is either playing with a wind of a string or combined, or a voice. Therefore, the piano has to become a chameleon rather than the timbre of the piano. You can do that with pedals, the left, the middle, the right. You can use the small lid, all kinds of artificial ways to organize the balance, because when the music was composed for chamber music from the 18th, 17th into the 19th and early 20th century, with piano, for instance, the piano sounded more like a harp with thinner tones because of the system, the strings, the straight strung, the non-iron cast of the soundboard. And basically, the piano was sort of between the harpsichord earlier, the continuo, the harmonic feeling, or before that, all the instruments of the Renaissance that were plucked for the movement of the basso continuo, the harmonization and the bass line. That's when the music used to be built from the bottom up in terms of its texture, the melody being the reflection of a harmonic progression of a melodic bass line, like the first prelude by Bach in the Well-Tempered Clavier. Even if Gounod added an imaginary beautiful melody for an imaginary Ave Maria. But generally, we find ourselves confronted to the fact that the modern pianos are built to project beyond an orchestra of many people in an intuitive balance of a heroic style concerto for piano and orchestra, where it's not a large chamber ensemble like in Mozart concerti or in Haydn or even in early Beethoven, but rather the Rachmaninoff, Scriabin, Prokofiev concerti, where the piano is sort of the army of one and plays equal in contradiction, in complementary ways, or in thematic materials, the rich textures of the group through the instrument. Of course, the piano can imitate the voice without the breathing, the bow without the limitation of the change of bow, but it doesn't breathe, or it has to breathe by accumulation of artificially added breathing points, which the instrument, to produce the sound or construct the sound, well, you cannot make a vibrato on the piano, therefore you cannot enhance the sound once you've held it, but you can hold it longer than a bow or a voice. And therefore, what you run into is that the texture of the composition takes in account instruments that for the keyboard were with a thinner tone and a shorter decay, and were often played truly chamber music, which is in salons, in homes, in large rooms, in stone structures that have enhancement of the resonance, or not. But in any case, not in rows of sitting audiences on the side of the combination of instruments with piano, or even without piano. But with piano, it takes a dimension that necessarily needs to be taken in account for the fact that you don't have different size violin or different, well, you do, but there are minor differences in size. Of course, you have quality for the resonance and all, but at some point, it's not about competing on volume. It's more about texture, richness. What is the composer's very concept of chamber music with piano, for instance, and other instruments, whichever kind they are? It's mostly harmonists, I would say organists, pianists, conductors, who wrote the chamber music with piano, the Brahms, the Beethoven, the Schumann, and so they think piano first, and then the other instruments being monodic mostly. They do have double stops and possibilities to play several voices for each instrument, but generally they're used by the composers as arias, singing melodic lines, and the piano as the harmonizer or the contrapuntal brooder of texture that brings in the mood, atmosphere, and basically psychologically coats the statement of the instruments when it's not the voice, that do not have lyrics. And therefore, the gestures of the intervals of the melodic lines are suggestive of tenderness, of drive, of emotion, of resolve, of hesitance, of anxiety. Of course, there are markings on the score that give us this information, but what do you do with all that when you played? Since the performance was truly chamber for people sitting around the musicians in the grand or middle-sized room in which chamber music was truly played, you didn't have to project and therefore balance the projection between instruments like the modern piano that are so percussive and progressively less lyrical. Well, depends how they're played, where you pick up the sound from inside the key and not from above, and how you replay inside the resonance, so that you erase some of the edginess of the articulation and let the resonance happen. But naturally, the tempo choice of a bowed instrument or the wind instrument, a tempo that corresponds to how they can control their breath or their length of bow. And therefore, the musical translation in their interpretation, therefore translation or reading, of an andante is not the same as a pianissimo with the pedal and the long resonance, even without the vibrato. Cannot have it all. Can indulge some unnaturally slow tempi, which could be introspectively beautiful. They almost bring you to a level of daydream that the other instruments cannot afford to explore, because they would run either out of breath in the middle of a word or between syllables if you sing, or before the end of a punctuation in a sentence of a melodic instrument with whom you play. Now, of course, when you play chamber music with similar instruments, woodwind quintet, though they are not that similar, my true example would be the string quartet, quintet, trio, sextet, where you multiply the string players with the same approach of the sound production. In the woodwind quintet, it's not exactly the same because the instruments timbres are very different between oboe, clarinet, bassoon, French horn, which enters often in the woodwinds, quintets, flute. You have, in fact, 5 or more different tones, timbres, colors. They could play harmonically together, but they won't have that homogeneity that a brass group has or a string group has. Therefore, it's no wonder why in orchestration very often the woodwinds have solo parts or duos or dialogues, but the groupments are the French horns and the trombones and the harmonic structure holding or repeating or whatever, but the homogeneous resonance of the sound color gives that piano the same. The instrument is a piano with shadow and lights, but you don't have a different stop on it like on the organ or on the harpsichord to a certain extent. So inevitably, if you only borrow shadows and lights, you have to voice. So how does a pianist take care of the balance with other instruments besides the volume energy is also a question of playing really on the keys, not above the keys. And when you lift the keys, you don't lift them fully in order to create a sense of connection. Would it be legato or just a warmth that gives a coating to the instrument that will sing a thematic material with whom you play or several? Therefore, your awareness is how to play transparent, the rich, sometimes very intense, dense, complex texture, which the symphonic composers wrote for chamber music with piano. When you hear a 2-cello quintet by Schubert, a 2-viola quintet by Mozart, you hear a quartet plus 1 of the same. And so you have more combinations of resonances and harmonic richness of chords that can go beyond the 7th, the 9th, perhaps the 11th and the 13th. Or you hear a solo wind or solo string instrument and you see what an ingenuity the composers have when they write for a solo instrument, not the piano. And where you have hints of bass, hints of harmony, hints of melody, or combinations of, like in the suites for cello or violin, solo or unaccompanied, as they say, of Bach. But you do have the suggestive connection of elements that are dispersed, like in a puzzle that your listening attention brings together. Whenever on the instrument, like the piano with the pedal or even the finger holding, you can have this rich structure and hear all the lanes going at the same time instead of just jumping from one to the other, to have the illusion that you follow a few. But that is a great illusion too. In fact, if I mention pedal for the pianist, it's a great glue for the sound, but necessarily not for the clarity and the transparency of the texture when the dynamics are soft, because when you lift all the dampers, then you don't control the resonance. You have these cross-strung strings that resonate. It's like beautifully rich, but in a way then when you need just a simple hum or perhaps a sigh and perhaps an exhaling note to accompany offbeat or onbeat or contribute to dialogue with the other instruments, then you really cannot play with pedal unless you have to hold something that you cannot hold as written. And most composers didn't have the middle pedal anyway, meaning of the past, obviously. Even the close to us, very few write the marking for it anyway. So let's speak about the right foot pedal mainly. That is the one that most of the pianists use, which in fact blurs, enhances the resonance and the volume. So in fact, you lose clarity, precision of the outcome of the landscape. You want to see all clarity so that you can see those subtle colors of instruments that come out or return into at the end of the phrase from where the piano was. And if you do that with instruments like, let's say, a woodwind instrument like clarinet with strings, then the bowed instruments and the wind instrument have that in common, is that they can give life to the sound after its conception, or they can do a vibrato, which really brings them in a certain way to interact in a very communality of organization of the sound projection from its before through the silence, it's spawned to a pitch and then a vibrato, and that leads to the next, which then can fade out to the third or fourth or whichever note, depending of the pulse and the dance or the rhythm or the articulation or the pattern, whatever it is that paces the musical statement of the narration of the storytelling, if there is such. In most atonal music, there is no storytelling, or not in the traditional sense of the word. It's more about connecting dots in one organized, programmatic way. In the other sense, music can be also, for chamber music, an accompaniment when the instruments don't have equal saying. If the ones play the melody and the other plays the harmony, then inevitably it feels more like an orchestra for the opera in the pit rather than a symphony orchestra on the stage, because of the fact that on the stage there is the aria. And I find that it's a great advantage lately that students can use when they have access to tablets, is because then with a Bluetooth page turning pedal, they can play chamber music from the orchestra or the group score or the general score of all the parts, of which they're clearly, the intelligence of their reading comes from their understanding of where they're situated in the GPS of the storytelling of the texture of the piece. When before we used to have only individual copied parts, where is by rehearsing you get to acquire taste, to know what the others do around you, to know how you place yourself, not too much, not under. We have to of course, adjust the vibrato with each other, the intonation essentially, which the pianists, alas, cannot do anything about. But the responsibility of the very color of the tone, and then it's live through the note that it's holding or into which note it's going. It's almost like a syllabic reading of a text that becomes all of a sudden a paragraph, and not just sound after sounds after sounds. Because yes, intonation is quintessential, without which it doesn't function, but intonation, where does the vibrato lead the intonation? Where does the rubato lead the tempo strictness or lack of? And how do you hold together, not always together on each beat, if you know where is your arrival point? And therefore, the rubato becomes something that you rehearse in order to adjust and adapt by listening more than you play when you play with the others, so that you know your part enough, you visualize it on your tablet, So you all have the GPS, not only the score conductor or performer on the piano. And so everybody is involved in the production of the textural development of the piece and how it goes through stylistic choices, bowing, phrasing, um, rubato or tempo, breathing, no, where, yes, accents within or above the dynamic range in which they are placed, and how you go for it from a point of view of a string instrument or of percussive instrument or combined or the wind instrument. Of course, you also have to know, especially when you play chamber music from the point of view of the pianist, you have to know also by experience, obviously, what are the ranges in which the different instruments for which a range in which the composers write projects compared to the piano texture. Composers take that in account or not, either because their instruments were not abrasive, or perhaps they were, but they didn't care. They just wrote it and they said, you figure it out. It's our responsibility how we cook all the ingredients together. Is the cookbook by itself, you don't eat it. So inevitably you have to go into understanding in which range, which instrument projects how much, in order to see where you are placed in your texture, either as a pianist or another of the same kind of instrument with whom you play, in order to see how, and if your thematic material, if it's a fugue or a contra subject, are you that equal, or are you just answering, complementing, or suggesting? That's why rehearsals are there for, and people agree to disagree. Sometimes they disagree more than they agree, because you construct something from individualities put together that has to appear coherent, as if there is a decisioner that is a conductor, which in chamber music doesn't exist. Or but somebody has to take decisions, and some have to accept to try this or that ritenuto, this or that appoggiatura, a little slower or a little less, and how we deal with a grace note and how we manage to make it coherent every time the same, or is it different in different ranges, a grace note on the cello and a grace note on the violin, thematically unifying, or instrumentally colorizing by their variety the very landscape or soundscape of the storytelling. I find it fascinating. Possibly rehearsals in chamber music are more meaningful than concerts, because either the rehearsal in chamber music is this laboratory where people agree to put their ego on the coat hanger, and then they try things they didn't think they should in the piece, or the style, or the section, or the genre of the phrase, or the form, or the structure, and see if it makes sense, because that's enriching to have different points of view. Of course, you cannot constantly contradict each other. At some point, some of the musicians in the group accept to follow, and some lead. Is it naturally or artificially? But that's how it happens. And ultimately, you have a deadline, and you have to put it together and present it together. Of course, you didn't spend time practicing it like a solo piece for your lifelong time. This is something that you cook together on the spot. Either if you played it before, either for the first time, or because you've played it with others, then it doesn't take the same flavor anymore, because it's very different from the approach of your other partners, even if you have already an experience of the path of the piece from beginning to end through what it goes through. And I find that the concert is, in a way, either the frozen version of the rehearsal decisions, either the rehearsal is a brainstorming that leads to intelligent flexibility on stage where you hear each other more than you hear yourself play, so that you can adjust and adapt to the unexpected on the spot. It doesn't mean that you cannot be angry at saying, we decided to do pianissimo the second time at this or that. How come you forgot? Perhaps you forgot, or perhaps you didn't think it was that important, or perhaps it doesn't mean to you individually that much, in which case you didn't pay really enough attention at the rehearsal. So in a way, not everybody has the same capacity to interiorize all the elements that are exchanged during the rehearsal at the performance. Therefore, the performance does not necessarily reflect the rehearsals. It's more as if the rehearsals are there to prepare for the various options that will happen during the performance, almost besides one's will. Of course, it's not besides one's will, but certain things you cannot fight either. It just happens if somebody is rushing, if somebody is slowing down, unless you want to go to the edge of the confrontation in performance and dislocate the togetherness this time for good, then it defeats the purpose of playing together. But if you adjust all the time to each other like an accompanist, then you don't have a common drive going somewhere. It's a very complex balance between driving and following, between inserting yourself in the group and understanding how the dynamic markings correspond to the group and not to your individual one, and that is to do with texture and instrumental projection, or what you think of the piece itself, or how you heard it by others, or how you heard it in recordings, if you heard it often played by others. Sometimes with age, I've noticed that performers tend to bring their experience of the piece and impose it on the others. And some accept to try it. And I don't think it's dogmatic in a way, but the reality is that music, no matter how much you want to, from the filter of the notation to the reverse engineering imagination of what was the intent of the composer before they even laid it on paper, and then how you take that centuries after and bring it to your coherence because of how you love it. Or it's not just about how I love it, it's how it means to me, or what it means to me to think where I place it stylistically in the time frame of the period, or what do I define this time period to be for a forte, a mezzo forte, an accent, a grace note, a bow change, a breathing, a pedal, passing tone with or without pedal, or in other words, we all have different approaches towards the same pieces. But when we have to play them together, then we have to, at some point, either accept what we don't agree with and try to be convincing through this point of view that we are trying to apply. Either then we insist to try our way of the tempo, the phrasing, the bowing, the breathing, the range, the style, the genre, the instrumentarium, the acoustics, the structure. There's always intellectual construction in any written text that, even sounding improvised, has a certain becoming of a meaning, if not at least a semblance of direction from its beginning, even if it's before it began with an upbeat or perhaps the silence before, into the arrival point with all the punctuations in between regarding where and where might be the climax or not, or is it just juxtaposed phrases, or just a build-up of something that leads to a climax, and what is a climax and what is the after climax, and how we treat the structure of the build-up and the tension release of the harmonic and dramatic or melodic or um, ironic effect that the music produces. In fact, it's a translation of psychological meanings that are without words embedded in the gestures of the melodic line, in the harmonization, in the modulation, in a secondary voice or two secondary voices, and how you bring in this embarrassment of riches the whole thing to exist in apparent simplicity when the complexity makes its beauty, but it's not all displayed, it's all inside the engine room of the music making. And all these things you don't have to, when you play by yourself on the piano, to discuss so much, because you sort of figure it out. The melodic line in the right hand has to be played in the top part with weak fingers. Then inevitably have to work on strengthening them and making the accompaniment portion of the same hand, like the first, second, or third finger, able to play independently lighter or independently between 3, 4, and 5 too for the melody. But if the melody is in the middle range of the left hand, then it's with the strong fingers like thumb 2, 3, and then similarly 4, 5. And then if the range of the instrument, like the piano, has heavier low keys in the action and high keys in the top, but pianissimo in the low texture, as the composer notates, you have to be able to do that and blend in and contribute, not overwhelm the others, become their pulse regenerator, be their conductor. At the same time, observe how they breathe, how they change bow, and follow that. It doesn't mean to be rubato because of each change of bow or breathing, but it's better than to go straight as if you're on parallel tracks and you don't care, you just like see at the arrival point. No, of course not. That is schematic and laughable. It's more about conversation of equals and knowing your part so well that you can focus so more on the others in order to contribute yours within the whole. So easy to say, so difficult to do. And every time the piece seems to take its own, it's almost like cooking a sauce, and it comes out differently because of minute ingredient difference in volumes or in textures. And a good craftsman or good craftswoman knows how to exactly cook it right and take in account all the elements of science that lead to the nucleus of the food that you combine in order to produce the taste that you want to share with your guests. Same thing here. You prepare so much the sound, the tone, the phrasing, the articulation, the pedal, the breathing, the ornaments, the embellishments, the rubato, the free feeling, but then be restrict according to the text, while it doesn't sound like you are just reciting it by beat, but you are correct by beat. So you don't bring out the bar line in your playing. You only read it because it organizes the groupments of beats, but the phrasing of the melodic line is at structures that are way overwhelmingly above and beyond the whatever amount of beats a bar, even with changing beats a bar. The music is. Very often when you hear a piece you haven't read, if you can read music, and you discover it after you have heard it, and you see that the notation doesn't correspond to what struck you when you heard it, when you had an exercised ear in marveled and going, oh, I thought that was really? And then you see there's almost a disbelief, moment of rupture of disbelief between the result and the ingredients from the texture's notation, and then how it's read and performed by this or these or those performers in this or those or these recordings. the same music meaning so many different things to so many people, but it's because it's not the same music. I think it is the same text. And sometimes, in all honesty, in service to the muse, we need to be reciting it. And in other times, we have to restate it, perhaps retell it our own way. Of course, if we over enhance all the elements that are already in the score, from a modulation to an indication, and then if we add to it even more of ours, then perhaps we overwhelm it with our subjectivity over the objectivity. Though I don't believe in 100% objectivity. I think there is still a meaning for which we play a piece beyond the obligation, if it were, which is to become engaged in the purpose of the storytelling, so that you're only convincing the audience or your colleagues because you're convinced. And you can doubt within this conviction, and you can rethink about it and say, hey, shouldn't we start this crescendo later or this ritenuto earlier, and this will reach us at that point better, and then strategically organize the things, like basically thinking as a conductor who doesn't play. But here you're a player, and so you cannot have 3 or 4 conductors play at the same time their individual parts, because then you basically tear the piece of the communality of the texture into individualities. Yes, it is dialogue, sometimes contradiction, sometimes dissonance, sometimes consonance, sometimes one leading to the other, major, minor, modulation, modal, tonal, post-tonal, centered or not. And what is our individual perception of the whole when we are an ingredient of the whole, and how we imagine the whole compared to what we are involved in. And not everybody has an opinion, but even if we do, it's not easy to find a way to impose it, because we respect those who have more experience, or those who play structurally in each given section more of the elements that are the drivetrain of the piece. So we sometimes just coast along. Depends of the sections, of course. But fundamentally, unlike when you play alone, though you should always count, you have to give up your tempo before you start by the upbeat given by the head in chamber music. And that string players who play with experience from student years with orchestras or groups, or even small chamber groups, wind or string players have always the experience which solo pianists and singers don't have so much, about giving an upbeat that is equal to the downbeat of the tempo that follows. Sometimes pianists just start and they follow it like a dog walking, and you follow the leash. And here you have to hear it so clearly in your head before it starts, that if you give the beat, the upbeat, the beat before that the conductor lifts before the music starts, has to be equal in its space to the next downbeat and the following beats after, unless there is a dramatic rubato effect. In that sense, you hear the music in your head before it starts, and you have to think about how you're going to manage it with the instrumentarium with which you play, in order to create also the musical meaning that you think the piece has, and then how the structure in which this genre is expressed through a form, and then those individual notes that are the letters become the syllables that become the piece. From the micro detail to the macro breadth of presenting the piece. and counting. Not only not to be not together, but also in order to maintain the pulse. If an instrument who plays the melody needs to breathe or to change the bow, you don't want to anticipate and play rigidly in front. You don't want to slow down too much because then it zigzags. But if you have in the piano part, let's say running 16th notes, triplets or something, or sextuplets, whatever it is, you can very subtly modulate around and hear where the singer will breathe, or perhaps sense by being so attentively listening to the others, not only what they do, but sensing what they will do ahead for the next phrasing and the next junction, how they're going to negotiate this or that. And when the texture gets very busy for your own instrument, to be still able to hear the others more than yourself, to be aware to not only follow, but think, hear, have the vision of the piece in real time from within while thinking from outside the box. Wonderful exchanges between instrument and instrument, voice and instrument, instruments and voice, and different types of instruments serving the muse with honesty, craftsmanship, artistry, and ultimately a pleasuring or a pleasurable experience of the combination of the instruments, where the composer has heard in their head so many ways of combining the elements that you can more or less enhance or less according to what you choose to bring out. But ultimately, surrender to the rail tracks on which you feel like you're gliding through the piece that the composer imagined for you and your audience. And ultimately, I think you have to merit the respect of your colleagues. You have to merit, by humility, their respect for being not opinionated, with opinions, not indifferent by just for the sake of making things happen, have a neutral approach, but have involved, tolerant, convinced flexibility, intellectually, emotionally, and mentally. Because you don't go to play chamber music to confront each other. You go to build something together, either because you've never played it, either because some played it, but with others, either because despite of all these factors, you have to produce the coherence of the moment where you are in the place where you have to play it. So it is to do with acoustics, specifically for the place, and the balance, of course, but also the understanding of the texture and what is making the balance issue, and the ranges and the different projection levels of the instruments in different ranges as the composers chose. Of course, we don't choose the notes, but we can choose to modulate the sound sculpture of the texture in order to accommodate the greater good of playing together towards one direction of an arrival point of a piece where we all contribute from our point of view, from our instrumental point of view. Thank you.